Have you ever felt like you don't have enough stories? Maybe you stare at the screen for an hour trying to craft that perfect social media post, only to feel defeated. Or maybe you realize your book is filled with a bunch of dry statistics and info dumps. You're not sure how to fix that. Well, then today's episode is just for you because you have far more stories available to you than what you may even realize. All you need to do is know the 5 types of stories that are going to help you connect to your audience and transform your ideas into impact. So stick around for this episode of Everything is Storytelling. You've heard it said that storytelling is everything. But what if everything is storytelling? What if every action we take, every word we speak, every thought we think is a story? If so, then we all need to be better storytellers, because the story we tell will determine the impact we make in our lives, in our work, and in our dreams. I'm Jonathan Jordan, your storytelling coach, and this is Everything is Storytelling, a podcast for people obsessed with story. All right, so today's topic is near and dear to my heart because it comes directly from my upcoming book, Start with Story. So before we get going, a quick little reminder that you can currently pre-order the ebook on Amazon. I've got the link down in the show notes. And the pre-order for the print book should be available too by now. And if so, I'll put that link in the show notes. But if for some reason it didn't become available at the time that this episode airs, don't worry about it. You can be on the lookout for the print version on October 29th. Okay. So it's a huge help for the book if you go ahead and go pre-order and grab it, because I think you're going to enjoy it, because it's really about everything we're talking about here, how everything is storytelling. And I wrote it to help people become better storytellers. But anyway, one of the big things I talk about in the book is the 5 story types. Got a whole chapter dedicated to it. And if you're going to use the 5 story types that I talk about in the book, if you're going to do that effectively, the first lesson is that you have to see story not as a sequence of events, but as a delivery system. That is, stories are designed to transport ideas from you to someone else. All great stories accomplish 2 tasks. First, they connect you with your audience. And second, they convey your message. That's it. That's really all a great story needs to be able to do. So yeah, you could see stories as vehicles, and your audience is the passenger that's in the vehicle with you. And you, the storyteller, you are the driver. So all you're doing with a story is transporting your audience from point A to point Z, wherever it is that they need to go. But here's where that analogy gets a little bit tricky, because when you're taking your audience on a journey, you're probably going to need more than one vehicle. So I don't hide the fact that I'm a Disney adult. My wife converted me to being a Disney adult when we took our first family Disney trip to Disney World in 2015. And so here's the thing. I'm more of a Disneyland person, but I've been to Disney World more times now. And so I I think what will help us with this analogy is don't just think about story as a journey in a car or like an errand that you're running where you're just going to one place. Okay. Think of it like you're going on this epic Disney World trip. And guess what? Whenever we go to Disney World, we need more than one vehicle to get there because we live in Dallas. And if we're going to get to the parks in Orlando, here's all the different vehicles we end up having to take. First, we're jumping in our own car early in the morning and we are driving down to Love Field in Dallas. Okay. Then once we get there, we park and we have to get on the shuttle that takes us from the parking lot up to the terminal. Then we get checked in, do all that stuff, right? We get on the airplane, we fly all the way from Dallas to Orlando. Then once we get to MCO in Orlando, if you've ever been to that airport, then you probably know that you have to get on this little, I don't know what you would call it exactly, but it's like an airport train that you have to get on to go from the terminal up to baggage claim. So you can pick up your bags and leave the actual airport itself. Okay. Then we're getting on to either we've used a bus before to get from the airport over to the resort. Lately, we've done more of the Uber and lifting type thing to get from there to the resort. And then once we get to the resort, depending on which park we're going to first, we might be jumping on one of the Disney shuttles. We might be getting on the Skyliner, or we might be hopping into a mini van, okay, which is a really cute van that is decorated like Mickey Mouse. It's awesome. Or not Mickey, Minnie Mouse. Getting my mouses mixed up today. But just think about all those different vehicles that we have to take to get where we are trying to go. It's the same way with your audience. You've got to have more than one vehicle to get them where they need to go. So this episode is going to kick off actually a series of episodes about the 5 story types, but we're just going to cover one of those today. Still, I want to give you all 5 now, just so you can be looking ahead. So here are the 5 story types or vehicles, if you will. Number 1, personal anecdotes. Number 2, problem solution stories. Number 3, mistake lesson stories. You might also want to refer to those as silver lining narratives. More on that when we get to that episode, because I've got a lot of those mistake lesson stories. Number 4, case studies. And then number 5, what I call imagination stories, or you could think of them as speculative stories. Again, I'm just not going to go into depth on that. So you can just let that be a mystery for now and look forward to it when we get there. But for today, I really just want to focus on personal anecdotes. And one of the reasons that I start with personal anecdotes is because they are so popular. Okay. You can see them literally everywhere because they're so flexible. So you'll see people use personal anecdotes in books, in sermons, in keynote speeches. Even characters in movies will share personal anecdotes to help fill in their backstories. Okay. So anecdotes, they're literally everywhere. All right. And you know what? They're really a great natural fit for fulfilling the story's purpose of why. That is, so personal anecdotes, one of the things that they do really, really well is building engagement and rapport immediately with your audience. That's why so many speakers will lead off their speeches with a personal anecdote. Now, that's not to say that all anecdotes are equally entertaining. When you're sharing your own story, you're often too close to the events to be completely objective. You really need to let others be able to provide that objectivity to see if the story actually works or not. So here's a few ways that you can kind of test this out a little bit and see if a personal anecdote is actually worth using. Okay. There's really 3 big questions. The first one is, what life stories do you share on a regular basis? Okay. So think about some of the stories that are go-tos for you when you're at a party or you're meeting someone for the first time. A lot of times you may not have sat down and actually documented that story. But there's a good chance that if you use a story over and over and over again, it probably aligns with your personal values, your brand, or both. So you need to put that one on the page. So just go ahead and make sure you actually document it, save it somewhere, even if you don't know quite how you're going to use it yet. Okay. The second question you need to ask is, hey, how do people respond to those stories? Okay. So if your go-to stories generally receive a positive response, then those are likely some key personal anecdotes that you can rely on. Okay. But there's one more question you need to ask, and this one might be the most important. Does the story teach something of value? Okay. Now, granted, sometimes a story can exist just for the sake of the story, just for sheer enjoyment. Not every single story in life needs to have a quote unquote point to it. Okay. But if you are writing a nonfiction book or you are developing a keynote speech, then every single word is valuable real estate for you to get your message across, especially with writing a book. Writing a book is kind of like renovating a loft in New York City. Okay, there's limited space, so you have to be really careful with how you're using that space. It's not like building a sprawling estate on a Texas ranch where you've got as much room as you want, okay, and you can expand in the future. Okay, books are finite, and guess what? So are speeches. You usually only have a certain amount of time, so you've got to be really efficient with your word real estate. Okay. So being aware of those space restrictions means that you really need to filter the stories that you're going to use. You need to make sure that they are fulfilling a purpose. And especially if it's a keynote or it's a business nonfiction book, you really need to pay attention to the education piece. Is this actually going to teach my audience something that they can practically use? Okay. So the way this looks in my work is sometimes a client will share a really fun story with me. And I'll say, hey, that's a really great story. But then I'll add on, I'm not sure it's right for this book or the lesson that you're trying to convey. Okay. And I tell them that because it may actually be an entertaining story. But if it doesn't connect to the point, if it doesn't help convey the message that they want to share with their audience, then it doesn't really serve a purpose. And then we're not really being very efficient with the anecdotes that we're using. Okay. So be efficient with the anecdotes that you're putting in your book or your keynote speech. Make sure they actually have a point. Make sure they're actually going to add value to your audience. You can save the others for conversations at parties. Okay. Now, once you search for the personal anecdotes in your own life, you're going to start to see them all around you. But just to get you jump started, here's a few ideas where it's really natural for you to look. Okay. You can look at childhood memories, especially if it ends with you getting in trouble. Those are always good. You can look at your romantic relationships so long as your significant other is cool with it and they're on board with you using those stories, right? We don't need your story leading to the end of the relationship. Okay. You can look at family stories. So this could include anything from sibling rivalries to if you're a parent, any parenting stories that you have with your kids. It could be weird family traditions. Like recently, I just shared on LinkedIn about how we put up a Halloween tree. That's not normal for a lot of people, but it is in our family. And maybe it's even stories about vacations that went awry, things like that. So there's a lot of flexibility with those family stories. You could talk about hobbies that you have or clubs that you're a part of. Honestly, the weirder, the better. You can talk about volunteering. So maybe it was a mission trip that you went on. Maybe it's a charity that you support that you're wanting to shout out. Maybe it was court ordered community service, right? It all counts. You can also talk about school memories, things, whether that's college or childhood, whatever. Okay. But the more embarrassing, the better with those school stories. And then you can also talk about things like the workplace, whether it was a conversation you had with a coworker that opened your eyes. Maybe it was a difficult work project. Maybe it was a prank that got pulled in the workplace, kind of office style. Maybe you are the Jim Halpert of the office. Great. Go ahead and share that story. And then I can't overlook this one. If you've got any pet stories, okay? So if you're a cat person, dog person, chinchilla person, whatever, if you got stories about your pets, people love those, obviously. So feel free to jot some of those down, okay? So all of these are some really rich areas that you can mine for personal anecdotes. But now let's back up a little bit to what I was talking about earlier. And how do you decide if this has a point? And how do you decide if this story is actually relatable? Okay. Because I think it's worth asking, is it possible for you to use a personal anecdote that instead of connecting you to your reader ends up isolating you from your reader? Well, yeah, turns out that it is possible to do that. So I'm going to share this story real quick about a copy editor that I know who told me about a book he was working on. And in the book, the author shared a really long, extended anecdote about an experience they had in another country. And the author had done this several times throughout the book, he said. But one chapter in particular and one story in particular was really egregious in how elitist it made the author sound. And it just had a heavy dose of arrogance, he said. Okay. So the real kicker was how the story's connection to the chapter's so-called lesson was pretty flimsy, he said. He said flimsy at best, egotistical and narcissistic at worst. Having trouble with my words tonight. But my friend who was working on this book, they weren't being paid to developmentally edit the book, right? So they couldn't really weigh in and say, hey, I don't think this story is the best. They were only being paid to copy edit the book. So all they were worried about was cleaning up the grammar and the verbiage, things like that. Okay. So he couldn't really give his opinion on the storytelling that was happening. And so he just kind of went along doing the copy edit and submitted it back to the publisher. Okay. So from what he shared with me, I sensed that the author had kind of skipped this particular step of getting feedback and hearing from others whether the story was actually of value. So, I don't think, from what my friend shared, I don't think the author was trying to come across as a total tool. But the choice of story, especially in this one chapter, certainly gave that impression. And again, either no one challenged him on this, or if they did challenge him about that, he chose to ignore that advice. Okay. So you really want to be careful to make sure you're choosing anecdotes that build rapport rather than repel. Okay. So here's some questions you can ask yourself to kind of filter personal anecdotes. First, will this story resound with my audience? I'm really big on preaching to my clients that you've got to center the reader experience. You've really got to pay attention to your audience and how they are going to receive the information. Okay. So you need to, let me think of an example here. Okay. So let's say you are talking to a group of college kids. Okay. You need to really kind of ask yourself in that moment, if I use an anecdote from my marriage or parenting my kids, is that going to be the best story to connect with those college kids, since they don't probably have that experience yet. Now it might, okay? The story might be good enough and strong enough that it will connect with them, but it might not. So you've got to think about the context of who's receiving the information and mold your stories to them, okay? Second question. Not only do you need to ask, will it resound with your audience, but will it endear you to your audience? Okay, so consider whether the anecdote shows you as a relatable, empathetic human. And this takes a lot of thought. Okay, you have to really sit down for a while with the story and think about whether it is endearing or not. Because on the first time through, you're probably going to assume it does. You really need to give yourself some space here. So thoughtfully examine if the story could actually estrange you from your audience, or worse, whether it comes across as boastful, demeaning, or condescending. Okay. And then the final question that you need to ask with personal anecdotes is, will this story allow me to teach a valuable insight or express a common pain point? Okay, so this goes right back to what I was saying before about it's got to have a point. And here's the deal, it's okay if the point isn't super obvious at first. Okay. If I had started this episode off talking about going to Disney World, which is literally something I just did, then you may have been confused. You may have been like, wait a second, did I click on the wrong podcast? Is this like a Disney tips podcast or something like that? So it would have been confusing for you if I had started off that way instead of introducing the topic first. But when you're giving a keynote, when you're writing a book, like it's actually okay for you to start off with that kind of story and then make the connection later on. Okay. So, if you're going to lead a horse to water, that's great. Horses deserve it, right? But you need to make sure that the water you're giving is actually really good water. Okay. So make sure that whatever story that you're leading off with, that it's actually going to be quality for the audience that you're speaking to. Okay. Make sure it has that common pain point or that insight that you know that they need. And so sometimes the authors that I work with, sometimes the way that they assess this for themselves is they will say, what do I wish I had known when I started my journey? Or what do I wish I'd known 5 years ago or 10 years ago? And usually that will help them pick an anecdote that if they had heard it, it would have helped them with their pain point. And so they can be more confident that it's also going to help their audience. Okay. And then here's kind of a bonus. When you know that you can tie that anecdote to the theme of your book or your keynote, even better. Like that means you've got something really golden. But again, this is going to require some real thought. Okay, you're going to have to really give yourself some space. You're going to need a sounding board to make sure that you're actually doing all three of these things, that you are resounding with your audience, that you are endearing yourself to your audience, and that you are giving a valuable insight to your audience. Okay, so you need to have someone in your corner who is going to honestly help you measure those three things. Okay. Because if you don't do that, and if you just assume that your story is great and you assume that it is teaching what you want to teach, I promise you, audiences, they're going to pick up on that BS from a mile away and they are not going to connect with the message. Okay. So if you want to keep your audience engaged, you have to be hyper focused on their experience from the very beginning. You need to understand why they picked up your book, why they decided to show up for your webinar or for your keynote. Okay. It's because they have a problem. And so this then becomes the perfect segue, because in the next episode, the next story type we're going to talk about is problem solution. stories. Okay. And if you just can't wait to hear about that because it's going to be a couple weeks, well, then good news. You can go learn more about the 5 story types, including problem solution stories, in my book, Start with Story. So, again, the ebook, it's already available for pre order on Amazon. Paperback, hardback, they're coming soon on October 29th. So, feel free to go ahead and check it out there. In the meantime, start applying what you learned today and start generating some of those personal anecdotes that are going to help you connect with your audience and convey your message. Only then will your audience want to go on the journey with you. So if you found this episode helpful, I hope you'll do 2 things. First, leave a 5-star review, a 5-star rating and a short review. That's not really for me. It's really so that other people can find this who would be helped by it. Okay. So it's a huge help for new insignificant shows like this one for there to be a review and rating. Okay. And the second thing is share it with a friend who is also obsessed with story, because when we all become better storytellers, we can change the world, one story at a time.